Men rising up to end the silence around us about the chains that bind us, to dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies, to finally become the hero within us all. This is Arise the Honest Man's podcast. My name is Karun Avatar Das. Usually, as per usual, my dear co-host Jai Jagannath Prabhu is with me, and probably our most featured guest, Hari Vilas Prabhu, is with us once again. So we're going to be getting into I think probably people didn't really like, seeing the title, Are You Worthy of Your Suffering? It's kind of, it's not so clearly apparent what exactly that means, because usually, one would kind of be like, more kind of like, are you worthy of your good fortune? But being worthy of your suffering. So yeah, we're excited to unpack that, and I'll give it over to Jai Jagannath Prabhu to elucidate.
The context of this statement for me, I suggested the title was I was reading Viktor Frankl's famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl is a concentration camp survivor. So the book is about how he was able to survive the torturous experience of a concentration camp, and how his book specifically wants to explore the psychological impact of that sort of suffering or trauma in life. So, and that's the context in which this statement comes up. He quotes the author, a Russian author. How do you say it? Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky.
I'm an American, so we get a pass on mispronunciation of names. So he has a statement that the only thing that he dreaded in life was being unworthy of his suffering. And Viktor Frankl is quoting this particular statement in the context of being in a concentration camp, where you can kind of say like, well, however you respond to that is completely understandable. And so anyway, so reading that statement in the context of a concentration camp and kind of trying to see myself in such a situation, it made me take pause. Like, what does it mean to be worthy of one's suffering? And I sat with it for about 5 or 10 minutes, and it wasn't crystallizing for me. So I reached out to social media to get some ideas from different friends, and there were a lot of really nice ideas. And then I kind of did a video on it, but it didn't fully concretize for me. So I thought it might be an interesting subject matter to unpack. And the reason I thought it would be interesting, particularly for our podcast and what we kind of are concerned with on this show, is that particularly when you look at like with men, the infatuation with like pornography, for example, or like video games, or this sort of new culture of like just scrolling ad infinitum, your phone or YouTube or whatever it is, Netflix, it occurred to me that that's probably likely a response to suffering, an unhealthy response to suffering, but a response to suffering nonetheless. And with that type of response to suffering, it made me think, is this response to suffering make me unworthy of that suffering? And so I'm trying to like piece together all these different ideas. Are people, when they suffer, are they unworthy when they respond in an inappropriate way? And Viktor Frankl's book, in the context that he was sharing, it seemed to suggest that, like, if you suffer, but you don't have the right response to it, then somehow you're not worthy of that stuff. So it wasn't crystal clear what this means, but I think it's an important subject matter, because the choices we make to life, including the poor ones, are generally a response to suffering. And so there's a need to understand, I guess, what is suffering? How do we become worthy of it? How do we respond to that in such a way that we remain dignified and so on? So I thought it would be an interesting subject matter. So I think for starters, I just want to unpack this statement. Like, how do you hear that? And what is the meaning for you when you hear that statement? The only thing I dread is being unworthy of my suffering. That's the statement. So how do you hear that? That's where I want to start.
Something's just coming up for me here, which is that if we ask the question, are you worthy of your suffering? Then that implies that suffering has to have a very specific purpose, right? Like, suffering is built into the experience in this world for a specific purpose. And that obviously then comes back to, well, what is the purpose of life in this world? What is the purpose of life in the human body? So then, if suffering has a core purpose, which is ultimately meant for our greater spiritual good, then the question starts making sense. Like, am I honoring this suffering properly to steer me towards my ultimate goal? That's just what's coming up for me immediately.
Okay, Hari, I specifically wanted your brain for this because we've had a couple of previous conversations about the nature of tragedy also, which were very inspiring for me. So I was really wanting to pick your brain on this.
Well, it's interesting when you sent me that quote and you asked me what I think of this, because I was just busy doing some academic studies, and we're studying at the moment a book called The Formations of Secular. So we're studying secularity as a concept, like where does it come from, what is it really, and because it's such a apparent part of the modern world. And it's very interesting because there's a whole section in the book dealing with the reality of pain and agency, and showing how the experience of pain, how that has changed since we have entered into, since specifically the world has become more secular, which I found just very interesting. That fits into your discussion, because a secular world is a world that makes a distinction between the private and the public life. And one of the things that happen in the secular world is that pain is seen to be something sort of random. It's something it's like sort of something that's not really supposed to happen. It's just something that happens due to a mistake, and then we try to correct pain by trying to make it go away. It's like one person deals with pain. If there's pain, it's like the first thing, well, how can I make this go away? And then I drink some pills, or I distract myself. And it's very interesting when you look at how we look at pain. And then if you travel back, say 500 years into the past, and you look, say, or even further than that, and specifically in this book, they go back to the roots of Christianity. Look at those Christian martyrs who were tortured for their religious beliefs. And you see how they saw pain, because how that's a big part of being a Christian martyr. It's a nice, interesting life path, and there's going to be a lot of pain. That's part of that kind of vocation. So they saw how they saw pain, and the interesting thing is how much it is connected with agency, with a sense of what exactly are you doing when you're suffering pain? Are you just being passive? Or is there an element that you yourself are doing something, which I guess it strikes exactly the same question. To be worthy of your pain means it's not just about taking pain. It's not just about having pain inflicted upon you. It's about yourself doing something. So pain is happening to you, but then you are supposed to do something to become worthy of that pain. And that is a discussion that only really makes sense in a pre-modern world, because in the modern world, there's no sense of being worthy of pain, because pain is just something that's supposed to be removed. And it's just sort of an accident. And if you're in pain, it's just you have to somehow get rid of it as soon as possible. And there's not this conception of that you have to yourself react or respond to it in a very active way.
I want to go back to this piece about, taking it back to the roots of Christianity in this book that you're reading, and pain for Christian martyrs is like a sign. I don't know, what is it, like a rite of passage, or, the image that I got in my mind as you were saying that, it was like a trophy almost, the ability to endure the pain for the cause of the mission, in this case of Christianity or whatever. And so that pain was actually embraced and maybe even looked forward to, in that sort of conceptual orientation. And in that sense, the pain part, to be worthy of suffering makes a lot of sense in that context, like it's something to look forward to. I'm thinking of, like, I don't know, I have this sense of being like branded, like, I don't know why that image is coming in my head, but in the old culture, you go through some rites of passage, and at the end they give you like some brand or something that marks you that you've done this, and you look forward to it. You're like happy about it.
There are some Vaishnava
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
They brand you with tilak, like they brand the tilak marks over your body, and I don't know if we can do that to American Vaishnavas, or it's like, do that.
Do they even do it on the forehead?
Probably not the forehead, no, but the
Yeah,
rest.
that's a little intense. I got this. So I got this analogy. I got this analogy in my head when I was trying to. I got several analogies in my head when I was trying to unpack this statement, and one of the ones that made sense for me was that looking at suffering is kind of like looking at life as like a high stake game. You know, it's like a high stake, like a competition. And on one side of the competition, there's you, and on the other side, there's suffering. And the trophy, so to speak, is the trajectory of your soul. You know, the outcome of this competition is the trajectory of your soul. And so the purpose of the game, so to speak, is to remain uncorrupted by suffering's corrupting influences. And if you are able to endure the corrupting influences of suffering, then you come out of the other side of suffering with the dignity of your soul intact, and you can like continue to prosper. But if you don't come out of the that competition, then suffering corrupts your soul and you degrade and invite more suffering into your world because of it. And so this is the only way I was able to, this was kind of like the analogy that I had in my head. And I don't know, do you have something similar to this? Or yeah, I don't know, is it healthy to see it? That was the only way I could see like worthy.
Yeah.
Like suffering was like, oh, you know, suffering's like looking at me and you're not a worthy opponent. And so soon as I contact you, you immediately become corrupted, and you go to some nonsense. You degrade yourself. You lose your dignity. So you're not a worthy competitor.
Yeah.
And that was kind of how I was translating in my head, so to speak.
Yeah, I think dignity is the big thing. Like to suffer, like we see. I think that's, you know, this idea of suffering as not being something passive, but something as something that you have to do something. And the distinction between someone who suffers with dignity and someone who doesn't. What is the difference? Both of them are undergoing pain. It can even be the same amount of pain, but there's a difference. Someone who suffers with dignity, and we ultimately know the ultimate suffering at the end is dying with dignity. I remember I read Achyutananda Prabhu's book called Blazing Sadhus. Very interesting biography. Ever read that?
No,
Blazing
I haven't read that one.
It's worth it. It's very interesting.
Okay.
And in there he speaks about how he grew up in New York City, and he met, when he was very young, he met this doctor, an Hungarian Jewish doctor, an old New York doctor, you know, from like whatever, the early 1930s or 40s, 50s, in that era. And then he spoke to him, and then he told Chitananda, he said, I've seen probably around 3,000 people die in my life. And he said, I can tell you one thing, very, very few men die with dignity. Yeah. And that's interesting how to, and if you look at Viktor Frankl's book, which is very interesting, then you also see the distinction that he have between people who were able to maintain what it was, a sense of dignity, a sense of self. We could really say a sense of agency, even amidst being inflicted so much suffering. Because Viktor Frankl's interesting thing was he was able to endure the total restriction of all his freedom externally. And suffering is that, suffering in one sense is the ultimate understanding. It's like limitation, like it limits us immensely. Suffering, whenever there's limitation, there's suffering, and even physical pain is just something that is so incapacitating and limiting in one, it limits
Right.
do something in the world. But then we saw Viktor Frankl, somehow his realization was, I mean, the story goes that, you know, one day he was sitting in a room and he was basically naked. He was completely starved. He had been, every single dignity had been stripped of him. You know, everything, his humanity, health, whatever, he had nothing. Everything was taken away externally. But then as he was standing there in that position, he realized that he still had the ability to choose how he will respond. And he
Right.
realized that nothing can take that away. You know, like even whatever they do, they can't take it away. Even if they take your life, they can't take your ability to choose how you respond. And I
Right.
think you're really hitting at the crux of the issue, where to be able to understand that whatever happens externally, you still have the spiritual capacity as a soul that is ultimately not eternally connected to what happens with your body, to choose how you will respond and to maintain that sense of agency. It takes a lot of bravery. And he also tells how many people they stopped that. They gave away. They basically just allowed themselves to just be carried away by their experience and just adopted the mentality of a victim, whereas he just didn't do that. He still maintained the mentality of an ultimate person who can choose how he responds, and he stayed basically positive. And that is doing something, even though you're not changing anything, but it's something that you do. And
Right.
that's what I think is at the crux of this issue of being worthy of suffering, being able to maintain the sense of being free and having a sense of dignity and choosing how you respond, and having that forced upon you from outside.
How does a common person, Viktor Frankl obviously being such an exceptional individual in so many ways, but how does a common person get to the point of realizing that ultimate of human freedoms? Like how is that agency actually developed and imbibed?
Yeah, that was actually my next question also. I'm just going to amplify it by saying, so you need preparation, or you need training, basically. If I'm going to enter into competition with this behemoth that is suffering, that has this corrupting power, I need to be, I need to train with the coach to be ready to handle that. So there should be some training and how to not surrender our agency, using that word, to these forces that are kind of vying for that agency. In other words, when you're suffering, the agency is actually always with you, and it can't be taken away from you, but it can be surrendered to something external.
Yeah, you can give it away if you
You
want.
can give it away. So then the training would be, how do I not surrender that agency to these corrupting influences, even when they're like extremely seductive? Like suffering is extremely seductive, and there are other seductive forces that really inspire you. Like, yeah, take my agency. I'm even thinking of statements like, don't speak prajalpa because in Mana Shiksha, because it is a prostitute that will steal your jewel of Krishnamati, of absorption in the Godhead. And the idea of a prostitute is that she's seductive, she robbing you, but you don't see it, or you don't appreciate that part. You only appreciate this one part. So yeah, how do what is the training to keep us from surrendering that agency, that most important of all freedoms, to the corrupting influences around us, particularly suffering, which is ever seductive?
Well, first, before I speak about one thing, I just want to say I remember there's the story of C.S. Lewis, who wrote, what is the book? I think it's called The Problem of Pain, or
I think it was the Four Pains. I saw it the other day when I was at the. Anyway, yeah.
But basically, the book that he wrote about the problem of evil. So the problem of, you see, the main problem that people have, if you want to believe in God, believing in God means that you accept what one calls, to really become a believer, or not a believer, but to become a devotee. Let's call it that. Something a little more like, it's not like specific to a specific tradition, but to become a devotee. We understand that to be a devotee, or to be a spiritualist in the true sense of the word, is a certain, ultimately at the root, it's an attitude that you adopt. That's really what it means, because you can have devotees who are Jewish or Christians, whatever, but in the nectar of instruction, it is, Srila Prabhupada explains how advancement in Krishna consciousness depends on the attitude of the follower. So ultimately, it's a certain attitude that you adopt, but then that attitude will be tested in the field, as they say. And there's a few big tests. The first test is enjoyment, to maintain the understanding of yourself as a servant, even though one is experiencing great material pleasure, or somehow having the experience of being in control. Like if you become a manager, or if you become a parent, somehow you feel like you're controlling, but you have to be able to understand, listen, I'm not really in control. This is a temporary experience, and it's going to go. So to maintain that attitude of devotion, even amidst enjoyment, is the one challenge. And the other challenge is to maintain the attitude of being a devotee, even in the midst of suffering. And that's why the problem of evil is there, because basically most people, when they experience suffering to a certain degree, everyone has their limit. And when it goes across their limit, what they do is they will abandon their devotional attitude, because firstly, because they lose their faith that God can exist, because they say, how can God exist in suffering like this? or they lose their, or they start to blame God. Like they might believe God still exists, but they start to blame Him, and then also love disappears from the heart. So that's the challenge that suffering poses to us. And I would say, like, if you look at someone like Viktor Frankl, so C.S. Lewis, he wrote this wonderful book explaining this thing about how wonderful, like suffering, the purpose of suffering, everything. And, he wrote this, and it was really nice. People were like, wow, this is amazing. And then what happened is his wife got cancer, and his wife died a very painful death. And he went through this very intense period. And then afterwards, he met a friend later, and they were speaking after, and the friend was offering his condolences. And then his friend told him, he says, but I mean, there's that book that you wrote about pain. And then C.S. Lewis just looked at him and he said, it's all rubbish. The book was rubbish. It's all rubbish. So even he got pushed beyond this. I think later in life he sort of again digested it, but even at that point it was difficult for him to see. So these things, at some point, we could speak about it, but so I like to always, when I speak about these things, because I don't know so much. I mean, suffering, what do I know about tolerating suffering? I'm just trying my best to be comfortable in this world. I think then we have to look at our acharyas, and I think the greatest example that we saw, again, if you look at if you watch that Prabhupada movie, and we see right at the end of Prabhupada's life, then he was lying there in Vrindavan on his deathbed, and he was still translating these purports, the books that he was writing. And at the end of the last day, his whole body is ravaged by disease. He hasn't eaten in like 2 or 3 months. It's completely, everything you can imagine, he's in a lot of physical pain. But then he has this last line in the movie when he says, everything in this world, even the blade of grass, everything in this world moves by the supreme will of Krishna. He says that firm conviction, that is Krishna consciousness. So, and that is the challenge that we all face. And I think the extreme challenge is people like Prabhupada or Viktor Frankl undergo this extreme suffering, and then they can still maintain that. But we all like training means you start a little smaller. You might not be able to take death, but at least you can take a cold, or you can have coronavirus and still believe in God and come out. We train incrementally, and I think that that's why suffering comes in these waves. So we all go through. So suffering comes to all of us repeatedly, and at least the message of the Bhagavad Gita is that the way in which you can use suffering to practice suffering when it comes is that you have to practice to not abandon your duties even in the midst of suffering. That is the essential practice. And we all do that. Actually, we already are practicing that. But if you understand that that's the practice and you become conscious of it, you also do it more firmly, and you become, at least we see that at least people I see who are quite elevated, I see that they're very hesitant to abandon duty, even in this face of personal difficulty. And they understand that this is a shaky road, dangerous path to go on once you start abandoning your duty for the sake of apparent personal suffering. And each of us, we have to choose where our limits, but the limits go, the more advanced one becomes.
It's interesting because in the Gita also, when Krishna gives criticism of being weak of heart, hridaya durbhayam, and Prabhupada's Bhaktivedanta Swami's comment on that is that not hridaya durbhayam, but anarya jushtam, that this is befitting the Anaryans. And Prabhupada's comment on that is that an Anaryan is one who will put his feelings above his duty, and an Aryan is one who will put his duty above his feelings. And so for Arjuna to abandon his duty because of those emotional state at the time that he's supposed to be acting, then that is the culture of the Anarya Jushtam, the people who are unworthy, I guess, of their suffering. That's also interestingly the conclusion of Viktor Frankl's book also, that responsibleness is at the heart of the human coming out of this with dignity, that he must stick to his duty. So that's just an interesting point. But I want to come back to this just a little bit, because I have this in my notes also. The training really is a training of the attitude. And I don't know, I guess I have this sense that in older cultures that you could receive something, I don't know how else to put it, but call it like a sacred wound, And I came across this term in another book I was reading some years ago, but sacred wounds, like a wound that was kind of inflicted upon you consciously by those who kind of like loved you, in order to prepare your mind for the greater world of suffering that you have to endure. But it was inflicted consciously. And then they were also like kind of educating you how you need to try to keep your attitude. I'm obviously thinking very idealistically. I mean, I did grow up getting some sacred wounds. My mom had a powerful belt that was used on the regular. And that helped me to understand fundamentally that life was suffering and that I need to adjust my attitude. But I'm thinking of something that's like more calculated. And I guess maybe this is the problem of the secular world. We grew up in the secular world and we didn't kind of grow up with these sorts of rights. And so I'm wondering, without receiving such sacred, I'm calling them sacred wounds, in the sense that they can help lead to completion, even though it's like kind of a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And without that, how will we really get the real attitude? How will we not become a C.S. Lewis who writes a nice book about it and then experiences, some flavor of it, and then it's like, this is all rubbish.
I don't know. I think that it starts with, if I look at very experts, see, that's why we get a guru. See, the purpose of the guru ultimately. Like we see that the few verses that explain what is a guru really. We see the guru principle is everywhere in the world. Everybody's looking for a guru, but then there's like a real guru and then there's a false guru. So we understand that. So people are looking for, that we all have a natural innate desire to have a guru, but then we cheat ourselves and we take a guru that's not really real. And we understand that the real principle of the guru, there's a few purports in the Bhagavatam where Bhaktivinoda Swami would explain how it's not really the guru. One should never approach a guru in order for the idea of increasing one's material prosperity. That the purpose of the guru is to teach one the proper mentality. So that means we understand that if one is really truly pursuing, if one is really putting oneself under the guidance of the guru then will inflict sacred wounds, meaning not necessarily that he will hurt you, but he will ask you to do things that are difficult. I remember actually when I was coming to New York City, it was interesting because I could see that the expert spiritual teacher, he has to somehow convince the disciple to voluntarily take up responsibility. Yeah, it has to be voluntary, and you have to voluntarily take that responsibility. You cannot just tell people to do it. So I remember my guru, when I told him, when he wanted me to come to New York City, and I didn't really want to come, but in any case, at a certain point I understood that, listen, this is the next step for me. This is like the thing that now will take me forward in my spiritual life. And then I made a decision. I said, okay, I want to stay. He never asked me what I said, but then he sat and he spoke to me and he told me, he said, okay, so now you're going to stay here. And he used his exact term. He said, you have to understand, you will get scratched. Like, you're going to take this one, you're not going to go through this without getting hurt, basically. You're going to take something. And but then he told me, he said, but he said, it's not that, he says, nowadays the guru is to be so careful in the modern world because you don't want to put your disciple in a difficult situation, because then they will come back and they will blame the guru. How could you put him in the situation? But he said, no one cared. He said, they just threw me. I was just thrown into the deep end, and then I was forced to learn how to swim. So it's very interesting how the culture, Vedic culture, which is spiritual mass, is a culture. It's very difficult to reconcile with this modern culture in which people become offended almost if you ask them to do something that's difficult, and because people assume that suffering means something has gone wrong. And then it's very difficult for the guru to do his job. And therefore, it starts with at least having the attitude of understanding that, you have to decide what it is that you really want. If you want material prosperity or comfort, then you should understand that you won't be able to actually digest a spiritual master that wants to give you something more. Whereas at least, so one has to start with that willingness to undergo something difficult for a sake higher than himself. Because then when the difficulty comes, you won't freak out.
Right.
That's what they see. People, they freak out when it gets difficult, and then you have to adjust the situation. So that willingness, and I think it starts with, we see that Bhaktivedanta Swami, for example, he explained before people move into the temple, he said they should first become convinced that this is the way to live, this is the high life, and then they will voluntarily follow the difficulties. He says they will voluntarily follow the austerity of what it means to actually live a principled life. So you have to become personally convinced first, and that requires good philosophy. And you have to also protect yourself then from bad philosophy, because there's a lot of bad philosophy around there where people confuse genuine spiritual life as meaning when you genuinely practice spiritual life, then you will experience abundance, prosperity, and no discomfort.
Sorry, that word abundance, I have a really hard time with it. Just I feel like it's like a pejorative.
Sorry,
or an expletive.
yeah, you're like, oh, cringy. That's my God.
So good philosophy. I want to come back to this worthy bit because you need good philosophy. When I first shared this with Karuna Avatar, he immediately was apprehensive because of the worthy bit of the phrase, and then because there's a lot of sensitivity around not being worthy, in this world where things like distinction between race and sexuality and this thing and that thing. So people are like pretty hypersensitive about this worthy word. Like this word is a very triggering word. And people don't like the sense of, no one likes the sense of being unworthy. And so I wanted to just make the distinction, like, at least philosophically, there's like the inherent worth of the self. And then there's like the conventional worth. And so the inherent worth can't be taken away. That's on the ontological level. But on the empirical level, there's like this gradation, and you can go up or down. You're worthy in terms of certain accomplishments, or maybe in terms of looks or whatever. There's some material criteria there. And so, this worthy bit, I think, is the part that makes this statement a little bit cringe, like hard to digest, particularly in the context of like some very intense suffering, like Viktor Frankl, for example. That could happen to anyone. And in the sense that, some governments take over and then you're all of a sudden in a very similar situation. And somehow you come out of that. But suppose you come out of that broken. Are we prepared to say, now, obviously, we're not going to go and say this to someone's face, but just in terms of this conversation, in terms of this statement, are we prepared to say that, well, that means they were unworthy of their suffering? And as a result, they're inviting more, suffering to the world. Like, is that the thinking here? I think that's the part that, I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking for you, Karuna Avatar, but I just remember, your immediate apprehension because of that word worthy. And this is kind of how it translated in my head. Well, it's totally understandable that they're responding in this way. Give a current events thing, the George Floyd or that whole thing, Black Lives Matter. And people, and I don't know how to say this without, I don't want to get, but there was a certain response that came where people in a certain groups or demographics, they were responding like with aggression, maybe not everyone, but there was a certain portion maybe responding with aggression and doing things that seemed to me to just be wrong. And when I was talking to a lot of my personal friends, particularly my friends in Black bodies, I was having a lot of conversations with a lot of them, and we were discussing this. And I was saying, I don't know, this seems like it's wrong. And a lot of my friends were saying, well, because of the intensity of the suffering, this is completely understandable, and therefore they should kind of get a pass. And in my head, it was just like, no, it's just wrong. And in the context of the language we're discussing now, maybe they're just unworthy of their suffering. Like, are we prepared to think like that about this sort of situation? I'm asking about this worthy bit, because that's the part that pinches people today a lot.
Also, I'll just sorry, I just want to add briefly to that. I think it's also a major aspect of the triggering part is just like, people are freaking weak, these days. I am just weak in so many ways. And it's like, God, it takes so much to somehow or other in this absurd like world that we live in, be virtuous and noble and accept your suffering like a, it's just like a hell of a tall, it's a hell of a tall order, it seems. So that was just kind of the thing.
Well,
Anyway.
firstly, also, I mean, I think we have to understand that we're not glorifying suffering as if it's something virtuous. It's like
Right.
suffering is not a good thing. You know, that's the first thing to understand, that suffering is not good. Suffering is not like when you go back to the spiritual world and then there's like, you know, a torture rack and all this kind of, it's cool and it's wonderful and that's what you do when you're even in an eternal position. No, suffering sucks. And we see also that suffering, it is the job of administrators to mitigate suffering. That's also a fact. Like we see when in Ramachandra's, in the reign of Lord Ram, when one Brahmana's son died before him and he took it, it was the responsibility of the king. What kind of kingdom is this where the son dies before his father? So we see that, or is it Krishna? Any case, it's there somewhere. So we see that, and we see even in the, what's it, in the 15th or 13th chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, where it's explained how that it is the demoniac who inflicts suffering upon the self, even torturing the super soul. So
Right.
people also get a kick out of suffering. I think also then I use that example of the early Christian martyrs, and we saw that sometimes did actually happen, like where they get maybe into self-flagellation and all these kind of things, like somehow assuming suffering as virtuous in and of itself. Now that's not natural, and we see that even the impetus to avoid suffering is very important, even on the spiritual path. It is natural that one wants to know about suffering. The sense of suffering that we embrace is the suffering that is an inevitable consequence of trying to pursue something glorious. And that's like that suffering we embrace voluntarily. But it is natural for all other, one has to, like, you know, abiding by the mode of goodness. Why is it that the mode of goodness is such an important part for the spiritualist? Because the mode of goodness allows you to avoid so much unnecessary suffering. Think about even the first consequence of properly practicing devotional service is klesha agni, which means the mitigation of the kleshas, the afflictions that come. So we have to be careful to just now say that, you know, suffering is good. Why are you complaining? Come on, you know, just suffer. It's wonderful. And, you know, you're just whatever. So we don't want to be like that. It's just that specific, that to understand that even if I'm doing the right thing, still there will be some suffering, and even sometimes I have to embrace some specific voluntary suffering for the sake of a greater good, and that is glorious. And but one still is allowed, or it is natural that one should try to avoid suffering as much as possible, because in general it takes a lot of energy to suffer with dignity. So
Right.
that energy suited someone else, and when people become, it is injustice, the injustice that comes from suffering should be it shouldn't be glorified, and that is what I think the only spiritual people can get into trouble, because they can just basically tell other people that, yeah, you should just tolerate your suffering, whereas it's not like that. And any person who has subordinates or people who are under his care, he has a actual divine duty to try to mitigate their suffering as much as possible.
I in Viktor Frankl's book, and this is kind of the last of some of the ideas that I had around this topic. His concern was about the psychological responses that the concentration camp had on the different minds of the people there. And it seemed to me, as far as the Gita philosophy is concerned, the psychological responses are threefold: sattva, rajas, and tamas. And he kind of interestingly gives more or less three divisions here that I found to be interesting. Basically, he says when you suffer, there's a will to meaning, like you want to discover the meaning of that and how you can integrate that so that you may, charge forward towards this glorious end. The glorious end here meaning minimally a dignified life or a dignified existence. And then he says, or it can be the will to pleasure or power. And in place where there isn't meaning to be looked at, then people kind of just lose themselves in pleasure. Or they may they go for power, as I do feel like a lot of the social movements today, despite all having noble aims on the one hand, I do feel like a lot of people, it's a power thing also, like retribution, maybe even a desire for vengeance. There's a little bit of that element that's there also as a natural psychological response to suffering. It's a will to power, or the will to pleasure, or the will to destruction, like a more tamasic mode of being. So I feel that, as you said, it's hard to, how did you put it? it takes a lot of energy to suffer with dignity, which means like looking for that sort of sattvic psychological response. What is the meaning of this? Often devotees like to say, oh, this is Krishna's mercy, and what is the meaning for that? So how do we, I guess I'm going to say, how do we prepare ourselves, or what would be your insight to someone that you're training anew, how to get that psychological, like pointing out these are the three sorts of general categories of responses, and how do we buttress ourselves so that our minds, I mean to say specifically, so that we have a better chance of having that sort of psychological response to a suffering condition or a situation where it's a little uncomfortable? Or is it just like you got to live in the mode of goodness, otherwise it's just going to be impossible? Like, what's that all about?
Nah. The mode of goodness, how much goodness can we? If you're going to bank your money on goodness in Kali Yuga, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
I do think that the core thing that allows us to suffer with dignity is as I said, is higher loyalties. Because suffering is inflicted on the body and the mind. Suffering can only be it's only experienced, just like heat and cold. It's only inflicted on the body. It's not inflicted on the soul. So it means that if you have some higher loyalties that pull your experience towards a higher level, that is the root principle of suffering. And therefore, we also see in that sense, that's why suffering has utility. So just like violence, for example, is not a good thing, but in this world, it has utility. It sometimes has to be. So that's the same thing. Suffering is not a good thing, but it has utility. And what it does is it actually can facilitate you to get to a higher level of identification in the body and the mind. And we see everybody does it. Like if you train as a Marine or as a SEAL, they undergo so much suffering. My God, so much physical pain that they undergo to make the mind strong, because it forces you to go to a higher level. And for the devotee, for the devoted, we see that basically what happens is you have to be pulled to your higher loyalties. So I think it is by cultivating loyalty. The big challenge for you guys, is that we are disloyal, and that disloyalty, the first principle of spiritual life is to cultivate at least some loyalty. You might not be able to have love, but at least you can try to be loyal. And even that's the basis of all love in this world. Even if you think about something like marriage, it's very difficult to love another person. So to fall in love is very easy, but after about 6 months, it goes away. Because in the beginning, it is just we feel in love and we feel we're willing to sacrifice everything, but it's just because there's that initial biological rush. But then when that thing runs out, then what will happen is, and I have this experience. I spoke to many people who got married. Like for monks, it's very interesting because you're monastic in our culture. You're monastic for a while, and you into that thing, and basically you just generally shift out of monastic life because you just becomes too difficult. Your mind becomes tormented by the desire for sexuality, and then you get involved with a specific person, and then many people would see that after a year or two, then it's like the same thing is there. You're still gonna have desire to be interested in other women or other men, but then the principle is that you have to be loyal. So that the loyalty is such a foundational part in actually cultivating real substantial love. And I think that that same principle is there in terms of training. That principle of training, you have to somehow, how do we invoke loyalty to people? It is when you can be loyal to a cause. That's the only way in which one can be able to suffer with somebody. Because one has to see that if I sell, what happens when you sell out to your suffering? Will you bow down to your suffering?
I like that.
That's what it means. It means that now you will abandon something, but if you are loyal enough to something higher, then that's what convinces you not to do it. And you see it when people come and they complain about the difficulties that come by sticking to a certain path. That's if you can understand this practically. If I really get into this and if I try to avoid the suffering, I will have to abandon my loyalties, just like in a relationship. Suffering comes from being with this other person. There's some issues, but then the only way, if I want to avoid that suffering, it means I will have to break my commitment.
Mm.
You're like, okay, well, I can't break the commitment, but now I just have to somehow deal with this reality.
I'd like to just emphasize this word commitment, because that's what I was thinking as you were speaking. Like, how exactly do you equate? How exactly is loyalty and commitment equated? Because I feel like loyalty is a natural result of commitment, and commitment comes when you sufficiently value something for its inherent worth and purpose and utility. Right? Is it that? Am I right?
Sounds great. Yeah, that's good. You should write that down. But no, it's really nice. But yeah, like, because it's
Yeah.
about sense of specifically value. Like, commitment comes when there's, and that we see the first step in spiritual life is shraddha, which
Mm.
basically shraddha means the ability to value to value devotion. Because the moment there is some sense of value, however strong your sense of value is, to that extent there's loyalty. And ignorance, the ignorance that we are fighting in spiritual life, is that we don't properly value spirituality. We don't value the eternal. That's why we oftentimes sell out
Right.
the eternal for the temporal.
Mm.
It's so amazing. Like, if you like, you have the Bhagavad Gita, and then where we say Bhagavad Gita and say, yes, we believe this is the words of God. It is spoken by the Supreme Personality of God Himself. Amazing. But then if you have to choose between this and reading something else or watching YouTube, then some other thing is that we actually value that which is temporary on a practical level above that which is eternal. So that is that ignorance that covers us. So that as the sense of value, the ability to properly value this thing increases, then the
Mm.
commitment also naturally becomes stronger.
I really like you. You speak about this loyalty point a lot, and every time I hear from you, a deeper appreciation or layer is coming up for me, and particularly this language also that you use, selling out to your suffering. That phrase is really clicking for me with the unworthy part. What does it mean to be unworthy of your suffering? You sell out to your suffering, and in this case, you sell out your loyalties. And I'm remembering a story. I'm not going to say it was a letter written to Bhaktivedanta Swami by one of his disciples. I'm not going to say to whom it was, but in the letter, the disciple was saying that my God brother this, my God brother that, my God brother this and that. I can't handle it anymore. I'm leaving Krishna consciousness. And so Prabhupada responded, which was a very interesting response. He said, well, if they're doing like as you say, then they are nonsense. And if you leave because of that, you are nonsense. And then he said that why should you miss your opportunity because of what they're doing or what's happening outside? Why should you miss your chance for perfection or siddhi because of that? And so you're selling out our loyalties or our potential because of some suffering is really clicking for me. But then, how, because you've also mentioned this problem due to the Maya Shakti, where we do tend to value the temporary over the eternal. So if our potential is the eternal, but our suffering is the temporary, and we put more emphasis on that part than our actual eternal potential, it's just kind of a habit. So then, but increasing loyalty, like I sometimes wonder about my own loyalties when I have a weekday of practice or a week month of practice or a week year. I wonder about my loyalties. And if loyalty is such an important principle for keeping us afloat and helping us to thrive, what does one do, especially in this age of Kali, where you can hear so much things about you can hear so much things about the things you're loyal to, which can really eat away at our faith or eat away at our tendency for loyalty and become jaded and cynical. And
Therefore, you have to be careful what you hear.
Yeah, I feel like you have to fortify yourself within the safe confines of like really like-minded association with those who share your values very deeply. And I want to re-emphasize this point of value, because that is the core foundation of loyalty. Like, if you're not really, really clear on your values, like how can you have any sense of sustainable loyalty? right? And just something that's coming up for me here, just to plug a very real and very pervasive example, is that we see so many young men, mostly, like as you were also saying, Jai, valuing the temporal above the eternal. When they suffer, even just like in the slightest way, when there's even just some kind of agitation, like what is the worst way that takes shape? Pornography. That's what happens. That's a major go-to when young men experience suffering in the world of today. And just upon reflection, because it's such a immensely because it's such an immensely difficult thing to overcome, it's so accessible, it's completely affordable, and it's completely anonymous. It's always available, it's right there. We all have one of these, right? And it's just so absorbing instantaneously. You can just forget about your suffering, boom, that's it, finished. But then obviously, like, as soon as then it all comes rushing right back in. And so something like that, as a very common response to suffering that we see right now, how is that overcome? And this is also a major purpose of Arise, and what Jai and I are trying to do, to help young men to overcome this thing. And kind of where I'm at in looking at it is just like, the value, your value of a higher reality, the extent to which you value that and to which you're committed to that. I feel like that's the only thing that can really sustainably save one, really.
How do we instill this honor, this sense in the next, let's say, the next generation?
Starts with this generation.
Really? I wonder about that a lot because, I grew up watching martial arts flicks, like probably the average guy. And one thing that I loved about all the martial arts flicks, that a lot of the plot always was around, you took the honor of my family. And I owe it back, to regain the honor of my family.
So epic.
Like a strong, like, I honor these people, and therefore I have to, fight a war, or I have to save the country or whatever, because I desire the respect of my superiors, and I must honor that. Sure. And we don't have that so much. Like, you see Prabhupada's disciples, they also amazingly had that quality, or have that quality. And I look at our generation, I'm like, and then I wonder about us and the generation after us. I'm just like, ooh.
Well, I think that, like genetics, what can you do, Certain things you inherit. And I think that, I know that there's like a kind of a social capital that you can inherit. And you see some people, they just come from very high-class families. High-class family means that you inherit a strong sense of duty and a strong ability to sacrifice. That's what real culture means. And then they just have that. Like, there's this story of, what's his name? A sannyasi who is from Germany, Bhushana Swami.
Okay.
His story was basically, he was like, Sadananda was the first devotee that Bhaktivedanta Swami sent to Germany.
Right.
A 19-year-old boy, he just sent him to Germany. He flew to Germany. He had like some magazines, and he had these little cartels, and that's what he would do. He would just go out on the street, because it was the era also, the era of that earlier days of the expansion of the Krishna consciousness movement. Was just, the loyalty was immense, like people just had this amazing loyalty. So he would just stand and he would chant. Every day he would chant with his cartels, and he had this book. So then one day this person came by, and he saw, what's this guy doing? So he said, what is this book? And he's just like, what a weird thing to do. This guy must have some belief, some strong faith that what he's doing is somehow valuable. So he came up, he took a magazine, he went home, and he just read the magazine, and he was like, this is it. So then he went the next day, and he sat down and he joined the boy, and he's like, okay, I'm part of this thing. So then once they were having a discussion, and another Swami asked him, he says, how could you join a guy with a magazine. Like, it's not like a building and like a movement, and it's just like you joined, but there was literally just a little kid with a magazine. And then he said, he said, no, I've always been like that. The moment I become convinced that this is the right thing to do, then I just do it completely. Yeah. It's like a quality that he had inherited in one sense by his karma, by his previous ability. He just had this strong sense of loyalty doing what is right. And then he is very fortunate because then it was directed to the right source. But he had that currency. But most of us we don't. Most of us we don't have that. We're not like that by birth, by very conditioning. And therefore I think we cultivate that a little bit, like we try to develop it, but even if we don't have it, if we look at it's very interesting that therefore different processes are given in different ages. That's what the conception we have in the Vedic tradition is that in different eras there's different yoga dharmas. You know, there's different processes given for different periods, taking account the condition of the people. And we see that the principle of Lord Chaitanya, who was the inaugurator of the yoga dharma for this era, is that we explain it is whatever the Sanskrit word patita pavana, the deliverer of the most fallen. And why it is that he is the deliverer of the most fallen is that somehow he is able to give an experience of how it would feel like if you have real love, even though you don't have it. You know? And that is actually the reality in the specific movement of Lord Chaitanya. Somehow you can have an experience of something which is only actually generally reserved for those who are highly advanced, for those who have high levels of love and integrity. But somehow if you just do a little bit, then you can get this experience. So I think for us, the reality is that if we are not going to be able to stay happy, if we are not going to be able to consistently get an experience that is good, then we will abandon our loyalty. It's as simple as that. It's just to be honest.
Yay, our generation.
Rather than trying to cultivate the Karate Kid mentality, saying that you have to become strong and become loyal. Come on, we just not like that. So we have to. I think that there's a practicing loyalty, like doing it, standing you, but at the same time understanding that your loyalty will squarely rest upon becoming absorbed in certain things that give you that experience that makes everything worthwhile. Because ultimately we're an experiential generation. So the real fight then becomes a little more practical to identify what are the experiences, what are the ways in which you experience the mercy of God, or how you can become absorbed in that gives you that experience, because you'll be able to tolerate all these other things on the strength of that. So I've also in my past I've also adjusted. I also had a great appreciation, for that heavy mood, that like thing, just boom, and just loyalty and all that kind of stuff, and the power of determination, and you just and you're
Yeah, I remember.
like an idea, but the moment that push comes up, it's not. It doesn't really feel that good. Therefore, that I think that shift that we see is to shift to take our own bliss a little more seriously. That sometimes that becomes very practical. It means that you just have to be. There's so many things that we actually do like in spiritual life automatically, and we just have to prioritize those things. It doesn't mean you have to do something very painful. You just actually have to do those things that you like to do that are good for you, but somehow we just don't do it because we waste time. So, for some people it means instruments. For some people it means reading. For some people it means becoming involved in whatever the deity worship, or there's a variety of practical services that we actually like. And if we just take that seriously, take that experience very seriously, because that is going to be the basis upon which you will be able to do that which is difficult, then it becomes a little more attainable. And also I believe that, I think when we fail, because we speak about being worthy, if you fail, if you do sell out to your suffering, the understanding is that it's not the end. It's like you just dust yourself off
and try again. That was an Aaliyah song when I was growing up.
You just try again, because the reality is, you see, it's like when you sell out your suffering, you make the mistake. Okay, you get into it, you become all lamenting. Like that's what it means. We see the Krishna ultimately exhorts you during the whole time not to lament. He says lamentation is a sign of a fool. Lamentation is a sign of someone who is basically embraced, who is indulging in his own suffering. And then the moment you catch yourself, at a certain point, it will run its course, become a little solder again, and you don't have to worry, because I can guarantee you, the opportunity will come where you can try again, because suffering is coming again. You don't have to worry, it will come again, and then the next time it comes, you again have another opportunity to try. So it's more of like becoming worthy is also like a practice, and one can never. It's not like a one or a zero. It's like one can consistently try again and again to have the mentality. And the classic verse, and what's that verse? You know that verse 10, 14, 8? You know, can you quote that verse for us, bro?
How does that verse start? I haven't quoted this verse in a couple of years.
Tatenu kampam.
Shuksha mikshamanam bunjana ebat mekritam vipakam. Hrevag vapubir vidadana namaste. The last line is the most important line, which is Dayabak, right?
What's that translation? Like, you remember?
So, yes. So you're eagerly awaiting the anukampam of the Supreme Lord on the one hand. Bunjana evat makritam vipakam. In the meantime, you're suffering the reactions to your own misdeeds or your own activities, and they have reactions. So you tolerate that. And you, with your heart and your words and your body, you continue to bow down or, supplicate yourself before the Supreme Lord. So the person who is able to do this, then that jiva, muktipade sadaya bak, he can inherit the muktipade, the spiritual world, Krishna's lotus feet, or he can inherit that reality if he's able to do this. Like on the one hand, there's an attitude of expectation and waiting for the divine descent of mercy. And then in the meantime, just tolerating what's going on around him and not allowing it to deviate his heart, body, or words from that loyalty, using your language, toward that reality and that commitment to that reality, not allowing his mind or words or his body to deviate from that commitment to that reality. Then for that individual, he will attain, the highest fruit, basically. He will inherit it.
That's the philosophy.
Yeah. I really like this idea. I have nothing more, so I have just some summary points. I think you touched on some really good stuff here, but this last point I think was really important. The follow your bliss point. This phraseology, follow your bliss. I saw it come up from Joseph Campbell. They have a book of his, I think, out. I haven't read it, but I just saw the title called Follow Your Bliss. And that statement always just spoke to me a lot, but it's speaking to me a lot more now just hearing that part. As sort of experiential entities in the age of Kali, we got to take our bliss more seriously. And if you know that thing makes you happy, then just do more of that thing. And that will allow for the emergence of that more profound commitment to that reality, because that bliss allows for the emergence of such a commitment. And if we don't give ourselves the opportunity, if we don't follow our bliss, then we're going to have a lot harder time. Even if you want to apply this principle or that principle, in the age of Kali, because you're kind of conditioned as an experiential focused entity and not so much an intellectual one or austere one. If you don't allow yourself the opportunity to follow your bliss, then you're not likely to make it. You're not, that sense of loyalty to that reality won't. That point is hidden with me very strongly. It's like very
No,
point.
that is why that is what we mean when there's the two things. There's karma and gyan. That are the two obstacles to really pursuing real bhakti, devotional. And that is that tendency to believe that renunciation will save us. It is a big obstacle, actually, to spiritual life. And it's something that is very apparent within us. Just like we all still have an attachment to enjoy. We still have an attachment to thinking that renunciation or determination will be my saving grace. Faith in that. And then, it is when we get crunched and we take shelter of that attempt to be austere, which is very ridiculous for people that like to sit on chairs and take painkillers and just not austere people, really.
Yeah. I just want to add to this. Like, firstly, I'm really satisfied with this conclusion. Like before the conversation, I was thinking like, what are we gonna come? What is it gonna come to? But trust Hari Vilas Prabhu to provide us with such gold. But I just want to add to that. There's this saying that the best defense is a really good offense, right? And so just equating it to that, that the suffering is going to come inevitably, and the best way to actually work against it is to do exactly this: follow your bliss in the most wholesome way that you possibly can, and generate sufficient positive experience in accordance with that. And then that's what really gives you that's what fortifies you, I feel, to make that solid commitment.
Definitely. And when we fail, when that time comes, when we fail, which is inevitable, it's like we inevitably fail to lesser or bigger degrees. Then the next question you will ask is, why did I fail? And then you have to understand that I failed because I was undernourished. I failed because I was weak. I think there's one commentary, I can't remember where I read it, but it's explained how, just like a man, even though he is very strong, if he hasn't eaten, then his strength is useless. And it's amazing. You can have a guy who can bench press, 400 pounds, but if he doesn't eat for 3 days, even though he has all that power, it's completely useless. So one of the authors points out that therefore, even if one is not nourished by just the actual happiness of devotional service, then even all one's strength will become useless. And I think that's really how one can be able to also understand this worthiness and not become afraid of it, because to become strong is very difficult, and it's not necessarily able for all of us but become nourished. That is not difficult, and it's the ability of the soul to be nourished, and it becomes less condemning in one sense, and it is just available for all of us, because each and every one of us, we have an ability. We will have something that can make us happy on the spiritual platform. There's something for everyone. That is a fact. And you have to sometimes be willing to accept what that is,
Dude, that's bomb, dude. This idea, understanding worthy in terms of to become strong, and that's not possible for everyone. But to become nourished, that anyone can do, is not difficult. So if you are unworthy, it just means that you are malnourished. Go and eat, homie.
That's it.
Yeah.
Shy.
Very beautiful. I have nothing more. I have to say I wanted to have this conversation. I thought it was important just because I noticed the avoidance problem or the poor response to suffering is a regular occurrence in my own personal life also. So I thought it would be an interesting conversation. I got a lot of amazing nuggets here. I'm just doing a quick summary. We first brought up about agency. Like, agency is always with you, no matter what you're enduring. And now it's just a matter of using that agency. This is one way in which worthiness is expressed, that you use your agency, and that too responsibly, like according to duty. Like, what is your duty in this particular situation? Or what is the best thing that you can do in this situation? And you use your agency to do that. Loyalty as a sort of impetus to remain strong, even in the face of seductive suffering or pleasure, allowing loyalty to rise above that. But ultimately, that loyalty being able to emerge when we follow our bliss and allow ourselves the nourishment of actual spiritual experiences to bring out that profound level of commitment to that reality. And so if you're unworthy, it just means not that you were weak, but it means maybe you were just malnourished, and that's likely the case. So go and nourish yourself. That's my summary of our discussion, the major hit points. Really, some really nice stuff.
It's fitting because we're ending basically around lunchtime. So.
Oh my God, I'm totally going to lunch right after this.
Also, just one thing. On Friday, we're gonna have a special. Episode. I just confirmed it, like literally right now. It's gonna be with Mahatma Prabhu and Ravinal Chambers, who just recently made this documentary film, Road to Vrindavan, speaking about gender issues in India, and just many themes around that. So we're going to have both of them on as guests. That would be on Friday at 9:30 in the morning EST. Jai, I hope you can make that.
Wait, what time? EST 9:30?
9:30.
Of course. I'm at least awake at that time.
So yeah, that's going to be a special episode on Friday. Please watch the space, tune in. It's definitely going to be epic. And yeah, Hari Vilas Prabhu, you're such a in Afrikaans. Hari Vilas and I are from South Africa, and we our both of our home language is this language Afrikaans. And so in Afrikaans, I would have said to him now, yes, Hari, I saw a start marker. And that basically just means like, you could always count on Hari Vilas. He's just such a golden boy. We love him very much.
Good for spiritual life though.
I get the most messages about you from guys appreciating the podcast.
Tell them that you come help me in New York City.
Some of them might be down. Thank you so much, Hari Vilas. Super duper awesome having you as always. And thank you for helping me unpack this. It was a bit of an enigma for me. And now I got a lot to chew on to nourish my mind and intelligence and nourish my soul also.
So we can suffer with dignity. All
right, family. Thank y'all so much. We'll see you guys on Friday, I guess.
Yes, 9:30 EST. Please tune in. ariseheroicman@gmail.com if you have any feedback, anything you want to share with us, and also Arise Heroic Man on Instagram. Righto. Hare Krishna.